I'm a 32-year-old guy, and I recently got engaged to my girlfriend of 5 years, Bella. My sister, Amber, is 28, and we've had a rocky relationship for as long as I can remember. Growing up, Amber was always convinced that I got everything handed to me while she was left in the shadows, which I never really understood. Our parents, especially our mom, have always stressed how important it is to have a strong bond with family, no matter what. But this family bond idea mostly seemed to come up when Amber was stirring the pot or pushing my buttons. So a few months ago, I asked Bella to marry me, and she said yes. We were over the moon and eager to celebrate. When we shared the news with our families, everyone seemed genuinely happy for us, except for Amber. She smiled and congratulated us, but there was this look in her eyes that made me uneasy. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking I was reading too much into it. I even asked Amber to be Bella's maid of honor as a kind of goodwill gesture. I thought it would be a nice way to bring her into the fold, to finally get that sibling bonding everyone talked about. Plus, Bella and I figured it would be easier to keep the peace by involving her from the start rather than letting her feel left out. She seemed excited at first, giving us big hugs and gushing about the wedding plans. I was hopeful that maybe this was the start of something better between us. Then, the small things started. Amber began offering her opinions on the wedding plans, not just casually, but in a way that made them sound like her own ideas were much better than ours. She'd make suggestions about Bella's dress, for instance, encouraging her to go for a more unique style that honestly didn't suit her at all. I knew Bella felt uncomfortable, but she didn't want to be rude or hurt my sister's feelings, so she nodded and pretended to consider it. Amber also suggested some changes to the wedding colors, explaining that certain shades clash with Bella's complexion. Bella and I had already picked out a color scheme we loved, so it was getting frustrating to hear her nitpick about it. Meanwhile, Bella's brother, Ryan, who's also one of my best friends, started noticing Amber's behavior too. He warned me, suggesting that Amber might be doing this on purpose to make things difficult. But I shrugged it off, telling him she was probably just overexcited and trying to help. Things escalated during the planning of the bachelorette party. Bella had picked out a cozy place in the mountains for a quiet weekend with her close friends. Amber, however, started pushing for a completely different location, a busy beach town, where she had some friends of her own. It became clear that she wanted to turn it into a massive party rather than the relaxing, intimate gathering Bella envisioned. When Bella gently reminded Amber of her original plans, Amber brushed it off and insisted that her idea was just way more fun and would create better memories. The whole conversation left Bella feeling awkward, but she didn't want to create any tension. My mom didn't make things easier either. She kept encouraging me to let Amber be more involved, saying it would make her feel included and help us grow closer as siblings. I tried to remind Mom that it was our wedding and that maybe Amber didn't need to have a say in every single decision. But every time I brought it up, Mom would just say, family comes first. It felt like she was urging us to go along with whatever Amber wanted, just for the sake of harmony. At a wedding planning meeting, things really started to heat up. Amber began taking over conversations with the vendors, speaking as if she were the one getting married. She discussed her preferences for the floral arrangements, seating, and even the music. I kept reminding myself she was just being detail-oriented, but her input was edging closer to control. Bella and I were both starting to feel sidelined at our own wedding planning sessions. The first real red flag came when I heard from one of our friends that Amber had told them a completely different date for the wedding. Some guests were genuinely confused, and a couple had even changed their travel plans. When I confronted Amber about it, she played it off, claiming she'd forgotten the date and mixed it up in conversation. She said it was an innocent mistake, but I was getting tired of these constant mix-ups that seemed to cause just enough disruption to be irritating but not enough to be blatant. Then, there was an incident with the venue. Bella and I had already put down a deposit, and everything was set for the big day. A few weeks later, the venue coordinator called to confirm some final details, and in passing, they mentioned how grateful they were that we'd decided to keep our booking. Confused, I asked them to clarify, and it turned out someone had almost canceled our reservation. When I dug a little deeper, it all traced back to Amber's helpful intervention, though she claimed it was all a misunderstanding when confronted. She said she thought she was just checking in to make sure everything was set. By this point, Bella and I were starting to feel like this was less of a coincidence and more of a pattern. I mentioned it to Ryan, who told me outright that Amber was likely trying to mess things up. He said it's common for some people to try to sabotage a big event, especially if they feel left out or envious. Bella and I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan might be right. After yet another accidental change Amber made with our florist, I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening. I told her she needed to stop interfering and let us handle our own wedding. But she looked at me like I was the unreasonable one, playing innocent as usual, and left me questioning whether I was making a big deal out of nothing. But Bella and I agreed, if this kept up, we'd have to take a stand to protect our wedding from turning into Amber's personal project. Update 1. Cuff. The first real sign that Amber was going too far came during a routine fitting. Bella had ordered her dress months ago, and this appointment was supposed to be a simple check to ensure everything was on track. But when she tried it on, it was like the dress had shrunk overnight. The waistline and bust were tight, squeezing her so much she could hardly breathe. The seamstress, who knew Bella's measurements well, looked as confused as we did. After some digging, we found out that the dress had been ordered a full size smaller. The seamstress explained that fixing this would take weeks, maybe even a month, and with the wedding only a couple of months away, we couldn't afford delays like this. When we brought it up with Amber, she was quick to blame the vendor, insisting it must have been an error on their end. But Bella remembered explicitly confirming her size more than once, and even the order form showed the correct size until somehow it had been changed. Amber brushed it off, claiming it was a simple mix-up, and said, "Thank goodness you tried it on early." Bella didn't say much, but I could see her frustration growing. A few days later, we had a tasting session with our caterer to finalize the menu. The caterer greeted us warmly but then started presenting dishes we hadn't discussed at all. Apparently, they'd received a call from Amber the week before, confirming that the bride and groom wanted to mix things up and go with a completely different menu. Bella's favorite options were nowhere to be seen, replaced with fancy dishes Amber had somehow deemed more appropriate. The caterer was nice enough to bring out our original choices once we explained, but it was an unnecessary delay and a bit embarrassing. Then, the photographer we'd hired, someone Bella had loved after seeing his portfolio, canceled last minute, saying another close friend of the bride had told him we'd found a better option. When we reached out, it turned out Amber had contacted him directly. She'd told him to cancel, explaining she'd already found someone who fit the wedding vision better. By then, I'd had enough. Ryan, my best friend and Bella's brother, stepped in and told Amber point blank to stop interfering with things that weren't her decision to make. Amber's reaction was to burst into tears, playing the victim. She claimed that all her efforts were to make things easier for us, and that we were ungrateful for her help. My mom, ever the peacekeeper, pulled me aside, saying Amber was only trying to help and that Ryan had been too harsh. I was stunned. Somehow, Ryan and I were now the ones being accused of overstepping, all because we'd asked Amber to stop meddling. As if things weren't messy enough, we later discovered that Amber had been tinkering with the guest list. Bella's college friend, whom she'd been excited to see, messaged Bella, confused about not receiving an invitation. We double-checked the list and found that several of Bella's friends were missing, while a few unfamiliar names, Amber's friends, had taken their place. When we confronted Amber, she claimed it must have been an accident during editing, even though the guest list had been finalized and locked in weeks ago. Around this time, Bella's venue coordinator called me, sounding a bit frazzled. She mentioned some unexpected adjustments to the seating chart, ones that Bella and I hadn't discussed or approved. Apparently, Amber had answered a call from the coordinator while Bella was away, claiming she was taking care of logistics and making decisions on our behalf. Bella tried to stay calm, but I could tell it was getting harder to deal with these constant disruptions. She arranged a time to confront Amber, who unsurprisingly played innocent, insisting she'd misunderstood her role in helping. The next day, I received a text from my mom, demanding that Bella and I apologize to Amber for overreacting. According to Mom, Amber's contributions were essential, and I needed to be more appreciative of her help. It seemed the whole family was ready to ignore the chaos Amber was causing, all because they didn't want to divide us right before the wedding. A few close friends began reaching out, sharing their observations about Amber's actions. They told us she was acting strange and suggested it might be time to rethink her role in the wedding. But I kept hesitating, thinking it couldn't possibly get worse. Then our florist called in confusion. She'd been receiving mixed messages, as though two brides were telling her different things. She'd get one set of instructions from us, then an entirely different set from someone claiming to be confirming on our behalf. Bella and I finally admitted to ourselves that the calls were coming from Amber. Ryan had been patient, watching as things escalated, but by now he was done. He pulled me aside, saying it was time to take action. We couldn't let Amber keep ruining the planning, and he suggested I consider removing her from any decision-making role. It felt like a drastic step, but I knew he was right. We'd let things go too far, and it was impacting every part of the process. So I set a boundary with Amber. I told her, clear as day, that from now on she was not to speak to any vendors or make any decisions on our behalf. I let her know she was no longer allowed to attend vendor meetings or participate in planning discussions. I could see the shock on her face, but at that point, I didn't care. I had to protect Bella and our wedding day from spiraling into Amber's chaotic vision. After that conversation, things felt a bit more peaceful, but Bella and I both knew we couldn't relax just yet. Update 2. A few days after setting boundaries with Amber, things took an unexpected turn. Bella and I started getting messages from extended family members we hadn't even told about the wedding budget, saying things like, "Wow, you two are really going all out, huh?" Confused, we found out Amber had been casually mentioning our budget to distant relatives, which stirred up gossip that Bella and I were being extravagant. Somehow, Amber had twisted a private piece of information into a topic for family debate. To make matters worse, one of Bella's bridesmaids reached out, hesitating at first, but then sharing that Amber had been trash-talking Bella to the bridal party. Apparently, Amber had been complaining about how Bella was acting like a breedzilla and hinting that she was difficult to work with. Bella, who's one of the most easygoing people I know, hadn't caused a single issue in all of this. The bridesmaid explained she didn't believe any of it, but she wanted us to be aware of what was being said behind our backs. When I confronted Amber about the budget leak and the bridesmaid incident, she gave a half-hearted apology, saying she hadn't meant any harm and that she was only venting. The apology felt hollow, almost rehearsed, and it left a bitter taste, but Bella and I decided not to press it any further. Then, a week later, we got a call from our venue. The coordinator sounded stressed, explaining that our booking had accidentally been double booked. Apparently, someone had confirmed that our date was flexible and could be moved if needed. This confirmation lined up with a time Amber had been in contact with the venue, supposedly checking up on details. The coordinator apologized profusely, but there was no mistaking who was behind the miscommunication. Luckily, a few of our friends jumped in to help us sort out the venue issue. They helped us rebook everything to make sure we could keep the same date, but it caused a lot of last-minute stress. Even after it was settled, Bella and I couldn't shake the feeling that Amber was going out of her way to create chaos around our wedding. Yet again, my mom chimed in, telling me I was overreacting and that I should forgive Amber because family always has your best interests at heart. Soon after, we started noticing more and more details that didn't match up with what we'd planned. For example, we'd chosen a particular color scheme for the wedding, only to find out that Amber had been telling people an entirely different set of colors for the decor. She'd also mentioned a theme that we hadn't even considered, confusing vendors and guests alike. Each discovery made it clearer that Amber was not just meddling but actively changing things behind our backs. Ryan, who had been supportive throughout, finally gave me an ultimatum. He said he couldn't stand by and watch Amber continue to interfere without consequences, and that if I didn't put my foot down, he might have to step back from the planning altogether. It was a tough moment, and I knew he was right. If I didn't put an end to Amber's behavior, it would only get worse. The breaking point came when I gathered my family to address everything Amber had done. I listed each incident, from the dress mix-up to the venue booking and the gossip about our budget. I told them plainly that Amber's actions were creating a nightmare for Bella and me, and that this wasn't something we could keep brushing aside. But instead of understanding, my family dismissed my concerns. They accused me of blowing things out of proportion, saying I was exaggerating and making a fuss over harmless mistakes. The constant stress and frustration started taking a toll on Bella and me. We were mentally exhausted from dealing with Amber's antics and the family's denial. At this point, we realized we couldn't fix everything ourselves, so we secretly hired a wedding planner to handle the final details. This planner was essentially our backup plan, someone who could help us navigate the remaining chaos without relying on family. Just when we thought we'd managed to secure some peace, Amber threw a new curveball. She gave us an ultimatum, saying she would boycott the wedding unless Bella stopped acting like a bridezilla. This demand was absurd, as Bella had been nothing but patient and understanding through all of Amber's stunts. It was a clear attempt to manipulate us into backing down. Then came the social media post. Amber posted a vague but passive-aggressive status about how certain people forget the meaning of family and loyalty when they get caught up in wedding fever. She implied that she was being pushed out unfairly, casting herself as the victim. Mutual friends and family members started commenting, offering support without knowing the full story. We knew this was her way of publicly shaming us without directly naming names. That was it. I realized we couldn't let her be a part of the wedding anymore. Her actions had shown that she was more focused on stirring drama than celebrating our day. After discussing it with Bella and Ryan, I made the decision to cut Amber out of the wedding entirely. It wasn't easy, but it was clear that keeping her involved would only lead to more chaos and stress. This wasn't the way I'd imagined wedding planning to go, and it was painful to cut off my own sister. But seeing Bella constantly on edge and Ryan having to defend us from within the family, I knew it was the only choice. Update 3. The fallout from cutting Amber out of the wedding was immediate. Within hours of making it official, Amber's anger exploded in messages and voicemails, saying I was overreacting and ruining the family with this childish decision. It didn't stop there. Amber called up every family member she could, painting herself as the victim. Soon, my inbox was flooded with messages from relatives accusing me of being selfish, telling me I was tearing the family apart over something as silly as a wedding. As if the family texts weren't enough, Amber took it online. She posted a vague but dramatic story, hinting that she'd been betrayed by someone close. Although she didn't name names, it was obvious to everyone who she was talking about. The comments rolled in, sympathetic replies from family friends and distant relatives who had no idea about the real story. Some friends messaged me, asking what had happened, but most knew better by this point and didn't buy into her narrative. In no time, my phone started blowing up again, this time with guilt-tripping messages from more distant relatives who'd caught wind of the drama. They talked about family values, insisting that I apologize to Amber before it was too late to fix things. But despite all the noise, Ryan, Bella's brother and my best friend, stayed firmly by my side. He reminded me that Amber's antics had made our lives miserable for months, and that cutting her out wasn't a matter of overreacting, it was a decision to protect our sanity and peace. Friends also came forward with support. They'd been witnesses to the constant drama and tension that Amber had caused, and their messages helped me feel grounded. Some even offered to help with last-minute wedding changes if needed, knowing how much stress we'd been through. Their support gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks, like we had a solid team behind us. Amber, however, kept up her narrative, telling anyone who'd listen that I'd only removed her because I was jealous of her popularity. She even implied to some that I was intimidated by her presence, that I didn't want her to outshine me on my own wedding day. I couldn't believe the lengths she was going to, but her words reminded me of the years of similar behavior I'd endured. I realized this wasn't new, this was just the same pattern on a bigger scale. In the middle of all this, my mom dropped another bombshell. She told me flatly that I should apologize to Amber, reinstate her as maid of honor, and let her back into the wedding. When I pointed out everything Amber had done, the meddling, the sabotage, the lies, Mom brushed it off, saying, "That's just how Amber is. She'll come around." She warned me that if I didn't comply, I could risk estranging myself from the family. Instead of feeling backed into a corner, though, this ultimatum just made my resolve stronger. I realized that keeping Amber in my life only brought chaos and conflict, and for the first time, I was ready to protect my peace over maintaining some fake sense of family unity. I leaned on Bella, Ryan, and my close friends, and I felt closer to them than ever. They were the ones supporting me, while my family seemed intent on pushing me back into Amber's destructive cycle. Eventually, in a moment of frustration, I took to Reddit to anonymously vent about the situation. I I wrote about Amber's behavior, my family's blind loyalty, and the endless drama surrounding my wedding. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of comments poured in from people who had dealt with similar siblings or family members, sharing their own stories and giving advice on how to set boundaries. Some even encouraged me to consider keeping a distance from my family altogether if it meant keeping my sanity intact. Out of nowhere, I started getting messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, distant cousins, old family friends, who reached out to say they'd also experienced Amber's manipulative side. One cousin shared how Amber had tried to turn their family against her years ago when she refused to lend Amber money, and a family friend remembered Amber's pattern of twisting the truth to make herself look better. It was both sad and strangely validating to realize that others had seen through her behavior too. With Amber officially out of the wedding plans, the planning finally started to feel like our own again. Bella and I could make decisions without worrying about interference or last-minute surprises. For the first time in months, the stress lifted, and we actually started to enjoy the process. My friends helped with the last few vendor calls, and Ryan and Bella's family stepped in wherever we needed. It felt like our wedding was safe again, and Bella and I could finally look forward to the day itself instead of dreading what disaster Amber might cause next. As we finalized the guest list, I made the decision to keep Amber off it entirely. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the right choice to ensure our day went smoothly. It was the final decision that solidified my commitment to set boundaries, no matter how much backlash I faced. A strange sense of relief washed over me as I realized this was the first time I'd ever truly stood up to Amber. The weeks leading up to the wedding were peaceful, filled with support from friends and the joy of preparing for our new life together. Looking back on everything that had happened, I felt the weight lift, knowing I'd made a decision that, while difficult, was for the best. Update 4. Our wedding day finally arrived, and it was everything Bella and I had worked so hard for, despite the drama leading up to it. But right from the start, there was a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. My family attended, but their cold demeanor was obvious. My mom barely looked at me, and my dad was silent, standing by her side, clearly taking Amber's. A few cousins nodded politely, but most kept their distance, as though they were attending out of obligation rather than to celebrate with us. I didn't let it bother me. We were here to celebrate our marriage, and that was my focus. Ryan, Bella's brother, was my best man and kept everything running smoothly. He made sure we stuck to our schedule, ushered guests to their seats, and even gave me a pep talk before the ceremony. Friends gathered around us, filling the space with laughter and excitement, and Bella looked radiant in her dress, surrounded by bridesmaids who genuinely cared about her. Then, midway through the reception, the unexpected happened. Amber showed up. She hadn't been invited, and yet there she was, standing at the entrance in a flashy, sequin dress that looked more fit for a nightclub than a wedding. She walked right in as if she belonged there, making her way toward the center of the room, catching the attention of several guests. Heads turned, whispers started, and a few people, unsure of what to do, looked over at me. Ryan didn't waste a second. He intercepted her, asking her to leave. Amber ignored him, claiming she was just here to congratulate the bride and groom, but her voice was loud, and her tone wasn't warm. It was confrontational. Ryan and a few of our friends continued to ask her to leave, and when she still refused, Ryan quietly signaled the venue's security staff. Within minutes, security arrived, and after a brief back and forth, they escorted Amber out. She didn't go quietly either, making a scene on her way out, loudly accusing me of abandoning family and calling me ungrateful. Once Amber was out, the room settled back down, but the shock from her appearance lingered. Friends and extended family came up to Bella and me, offering words of support. They couldn't believe what had just happened, many of them expressing sympathy and sharing how appalled they were by her behavior. Some relatives who hadn't known the full story admitted they'd underestimated the extent of Amber's actions until they saw her antics firsthand. The ceremony itself was beautiful, filled with personal vows and emotional moments. As I looked around the room, I realized that while some of my family was distant, I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us. Bella and I shared our first dance, cut our cake, and laughed with friends late into the evening. The people who stayed by us were there because they truly wanted to celebrate, not because they felt they had to. Once the festivities ended, Bella and I packed up and left for our honeymoon, eager for a fresh start. Away from everything, we felt like we could finally relax. The honeymoon was blissful, a welcome break from the months of planning and the drama with Amber. It gave us time to reflect on everything that had happened and just enjoy each other's company. Back home, though, things were far from settled. My mom reached out as soon as we returned, guilt-tripping me about Amber, accusing me of destroying the family. She didn't ask how the honeymoon was or even how we were doing as newlyweds. Her message was only about Amber, saying how disappointed she was in me for not giving her another chance. I started therapy shortly after our honeymoon. The wedding and all the events around it had made me realize how much I'd been pushing my feelings aside for years, always prioritizing family expectations over my own well-being. Through therapy, I began to understand that prioritizing my mental health and boundaries was not only okay, it was necessary. I didn't owe Amber endless forgiveness, and I wasn't responsible for managing everyone else's feelings about my decisions. As I shared my story online and connected with others who had similar experiences, I found an incredible amount of support from strangers. People encouraged me to continue setting boundaries, and many shared stories of cutting off toxic family members for the sake of their mental health. This validation made me feel less alone and reinforced my decision. Then, something unexpected happened. A distant relative reached out, someone I hadn't heard from in years. They'd seen bits of the wedding chaos online and wanted to talk. When we caught up, they shared their own story about Amber, describing how she'd manipulated situations in the past to get sympathy, often turning others against people who challenged her. Hearing this confirmed what I'd come to realize. Amber's behavior wasn't just a one-time wedding fiasco, but part of a larger pattern. Despite everything, I knew holding on to anger wasn't something I wanted to do forever. I realized I could forgive Amber someday, not for her benefit, but for my own peace. But forgiveness wouldn't mean letting her back into my life or giving her a free pass. I'd come to see that some relationships, even family ones, are better kept at a distance. Months later, my mom's attitude shifted. She had finally seen how much pain Amber's behavior had caused, not just for me, but for the entire family. She reached out with a sincere apology, acknowledging the toll Amber's actions had taken on me and on Bella. It was the first time I'd felt any true support from her, and while it didn't erase the past, it was a step toward healing. As I moved forward, I realized that I'd built my own family, a community of friends, my wife and her family, people who genuinely cared about us without strings attached. The drama around the wedding had shown me who really valued us and who wanted a relationship based on mutual respect. Finally, at peace, I felt ready to focus on this new chapter with Bella, knowing we had a fresh start, free from unnecessary drama. Update 5. Returning from the honeymoon, Bella and I felt like we'd turned a page. The wedding drama was finally behind us, but its effects were still lingering. My mom had apologized, but things between us remained strained. She continued reaching out, trying to convince me to fix things with Amber. She said Amber was deeply hurt and that families shouldn't let small misunderstandings divide them, but her apology had come too late. I was no longer willing to overlook Amber's behavior just to keep the peace. Despite my boundaries, Amber wasn't letting up. Family members started reaching out with their own concerns, mentioning that Amber had been telling everyone I cut her out without reason. She'd paint herself as the caring sister who just wanted to be a part of my big day, claiming I'd kicked her out of my life on a whim. Some relatives saw through it, knowing Amber's reputation for twisting stories to fit her narrative, but others believed her. They'd call, questioning me, subtly hinting that I was cold-hearted, accusing me of putting a wedding over family. Meanwhile, the family itself began to split down the middle. Some relatives backed me, saying it was time someone stood up to Amber, but others continued to support her. They'd tell me I was overreacting or taking things too personally, believing Amber's version of events. It created a rift, but I didn't regret my decision. I wasn't alone in this either. My friendships grew stronger as friends who'd supported us during the wedding became even closer. Ryan's family welcomed Bella and me with open arms, treating us with the warmth and respect that had been lacking on my side. They'd heard enough to know the truth and never questioned our decision to keep Amber at a distance. This whole ordeal brought Bella and me closer too. The pressure we'd faced in those months tested our bond, and it only made us stronger. She'd been my rock throughout it all, and now, as we adjusted to married life, it felt like a fresh start. But Amber's influence was still hovering in the background, especially with my mom regularly contacting me to ask for one more chance for Amber. Each time, I calmly reminded her of everything Amber had done and made it clear that Amber wasn't welcome in my life until there was a genuine change. Then, unexpectedly, my dad reached out. We hadn't spoken much throughout this entire mess. He'd mostly stayed silent, keeping out of the drama. But privately, he admitted he'd noticed Amber's behavior for years. He said he'd seen her manipulation but had never intervened, feeling pressured by the family's stick-together mentality. It was strange but refreshing to hear my dad finally acknowledge the damage Amber had caused. I told him that, unless Amber truly changed, I wasn't going back on my boundaries. Therapy became my weekly appointment, where I learned to stand firm in my decisions without guilt. For years, I'd been conditioned to tolerate Amber's antics, swallowing frustration in the name of family loyalty. But therapy showed me that loyalty didn't mean sacrificing my own peace. I wasn't responsible for fixing Amber's life or her behavior. Slowly, I started feeling a weight lift, realizing that life without constant drama was a freedom I hadn't experienced in a long time. Despite my attempts to distance myself, Amber didn't completely back off. She'd leave voicemails I never answered, and I'd see her at mutual events, trying to act friendly, as if nothing had happened. She even reached out to some of my friends, sharing her side of the story. I'd hear about it later, mostly as a heads up from friends who saw through her act. Then I discovered Amber had been posting vague but dramatic messages online, hinting at family betrayal and heartbreak. Her followers, many of whom knew only her version, offered sympathy, feeding her narrative. After seeing the posts, I finally blocked her on all platforms. I was done allowing her access to my life even indirectly. It was the first truly empowered decision I'd made in a long time. With social media shut off and a clear line drawn, I felt a new sense of control. I decided to write a letter to my family, explaining everything. It wasn't an attack or an ultimatum. It was a simple, heartfelt explanation of why I'd set these boundaries and why they were necessary for my peace. I detailed the damage Amber's actions had caused, the manipulations, and my decision to prioritize my own mental health. I didn't ask for approval or validation. I simply wanted them to understand. Months went by, and in that time, our life finally began to settle. Without Amber's interference, Bella and I could focus on each other, on our home, and on building a life together free from unnecessary drama. My phone was quieter, my days more peaceful, and I could finally relax, knowing I'd done everything possible to protect my peace. Surprisingly, a cousin I hadn't heard from in years reached out. She'd read about the wedding drama and wanted to share her own experience with Amber. She told me that years ago, Amber had tried to cause a rift between her and another relative over a similar disagreement. Hearing this from someone else helped me see that I wasn't alone. Amber's behavior was part of a larger pattern, and others had suffered from it as well. As time passed, I realized forgiveness was possible. Not for Amber's sake, but for my own. Forgiveness didn't mean letting her back into my life or erasing the past, it just meant letting go of the anger. I'd learned that sometimes the healthiest choice was to keep a safe distance, even from family. Eventually, my mom reached out again. This time she was different, less defensive, more understanding. She admitted she hadn't realized the depth of the damage Amber had caused until she'd seen her behavior firsthand. It was a small apology, but it felt genuine, a step toward healing. Looking around, I realized I'd built a new family, my friends Bella and her family, all of whom cared deeply for us without the strings attached. This was my chosen family, a support system based on respect and genuine love. Finally, I felt at peace, ready to move forward, knowing I'd made the right choice for my happiness. I'm a 32-year-old guy who's found himself stuck in this wild family drama, and I need some perspective. Growing up, it was just my mom, my brother 2 years younger than me, and me. My mom raised us alone, and while she did her best, there was always this unspoken rule in our house. My brother got away with everything, and I was the one expected to keep it together. I had to grow up pretty fast. I got my first job at 16, started saving whatever I could, and, over time, built up a solid foundation for myself. Meanwhile, my brother took a different path. He was always the one with big dreams, but no real plan to make them happen. He'd jump from one life-changing idea to the next, always needing a bit of help to make it work. But whenever things fell through, which they always did, it was somehow never his fault. He was the free spirit, while I was the responsible one. In our family, it felt like that's just how it was meant to be. Fast forward to now, I recently landed a big promotion, a pretty significant step up in my career. I've been working for this for years, putting in long hours and making sacrifices to get here. It's given me a nice pay bump, and I feel like I can finally breathe a little when it comes to finances. But of course, my family quickly caught on that I was in a better place financially, and suddenly, the expectations started ramping up. At first, it was subtle, comments from my mom about how proud she was of me and how she always knew I'd be the stable one. Then, it turned into gentle nudges about how your brother could use a little help. My brother, true to form, hadn't changed. He'd picked up some pretty serious debt, a mix of credit card bills, failed business ideas, and a bit of gambling, if I'm being honest. And here he was, hitting me up for what he called a loan, though he made it clear he wasn't in any position to pay it back. When he first asked, I thought maybe he was joking. But no, he was dead serious. He sat me down and laid out this whole story about how he was really close to turning things around and just needed a little push to get back on his feet. I listened, but I'd heard this all before. So for the first time in a long time, I said no. I told him I couldn't just bail him out, that I'd worked hard to be where I was, and that he needed to start taking responsibility for himself. He looked at me like I'd just slapped him. He called me selfish, threw in some line about how family is supposed to help each other, and stormed off. I thought that would be the end of it, like he'd cool off, think it over, and maybe realize that he couldn't keep leaning on me forever. But of course, that's not how it played out. A few hours later, I got a call from my mom. She was in full guilt trip mode, saying my brother was devastated and felt like I'd abandoned him. She reminded me that I was lucky to be in a position to help and that my brother needed me. She made it sound like I was turning my back on the family, and that cut deep. My mom has always had a soft spot for my brother. Whenever he made a mistake, she'd cover for him, brush it off as just one of those things, while I was expected to keep everything together. I can't even count the number of times I had to step up or make sacrifices to make life easier for him, all without any acknowledgement. But now, here I was, the one who had finally made it, and somehow it was still my responsibility to take care of him. I tried explaining my side to my mom, that I'd helped him out plenty of times before, and that he needed to stand on his own. But it was like talking to a wall. She just kept bringing up how family comes first, and that, as his older brother, I should be setting an example. I felt like I was back in high school, being scolded for not doing enough, while my brother got off the hook. After that call, I was left feeling pretty drained. I wanted to talk to someone who'd actually understand where I was coming from, so I turned to a few close friends and my girlfriend. They were all super supportive, telling me I'd done the right thing by standing my ground. They reminded me that I wasn't responsible for my brother's choices and that I'd been more than fair in the past. It was comforting to hear, but there was still this lingering guilt. Maybe it's years of conditioning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow failing my family. I ended up posting about it on Reddit, just looking for some outside perspective, not expecting much. But then, the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life chimed in, sharing their own stories and telling me that I didn't owe my brother anything. They pointed out that enabling him wouldn't do him any favors in the long run. The comments were eye-opening, and seeing how many people were on my side was a huge relief. Still, I know this isn't over. My family is used to me saying yes, and now that I've finally said no, the backlash has only just begun. Part of me wonders how far they'll go to try and change my mind. Update 1. The next day, I was settling in for a quiet evening when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I checked the peephole, and there was my brother, just standing there, hands in his pockets, with that same look he gets when he's about to ask for something. I didn't even get a chance to think before he started banging again, louder this time. When I opened the door, he walked right in like he owned the place. I asked him what he was doing here, but he didn't answer directly. Instead, he started reminiscing about our childhood, talking about how we'd always been close, and how I'd always had his back. Then, just like that, he flipped it, saying he didn't understand why I wouldn't help him now, after everything we'd been through together. I could see where he was going with it, but I let him talk, figuring he'd get it out of his system. Then he threw down an ultimatum. He told me that if I didn't help him, he'd cut me off from the family entirely. Said that he'd tell everyone I was selfish and didn't care about any of them. It was supposed to shake me, I guess. But I stayed calm and told him again that I wasn't going to give him money. I reminded him of all the times I had tried to help in the past, and that nothing had changed. He hadn't changed. He didn't like that. He went off on a rant about how I had plenty of money and could easily spare some. Then, before I could respond, he stormed out, slamming the door so hard that I thought the frame might crack. I stood there for a while, wondering what kind of mess he was about to stir up next. It didn't take long to find out. Less than an hour after he left, my mom called. I barely had a chance to say hello before she launched into it, crying, saying my brother felt abandoned, and was devastated that I wouldn't help him in his time of need. She went on about how family was supposed to be there for each other and how I was letting everyone down. I tried to explain, but she didn't want to hear it. To her, I was just being stubborn and heartless, turning my back on my own blood. Then I got pulled into a family group chat that I had no idea even existed. Suddenly, there were messages flooding in from uncles, aunts, cousins, people who hadn't reached out to me in years. They were all piling on, asking why I couldn't just help him out this one time. My brother had clearly already filled them in, painting me as the selfish older brother who refused to lift a finger. He even told them that I was rolling in cash and didn't care about anyone but myself. It was infuriating watching these messages come in, one after another. Some family members outright called me selfish, while others took a softer approach, saying they were disappointed in me. They tried to remind me of our family's struggles, as if I hadn't lived through them myself. A few relatives even suggested that if I couldn't help my brother out, maybe I'd changed and forgotten my roots. It was like they had all turned against me in a heartbeat. I went back to Reddit, updating everyone on the situation and venting about the family drama. I explained how I'd worked my way up with zero help, that no one had been there when I was struggling, and now they all seemed to think I owed them. The response was massive. People shared their own stories, urging me not to let my brother and the rest of the family guilt me into giving in. Some even recommended that I start looking into ways to legally protect myself in case things got uglier. It was actually one of those Reddit commenters who planted the idea to dig deeper into what my brother had been telling the family. Later that day, I got a private message from a cousin who'd been keeping quiet in the group chat. She told me my brother had exaggerated everything, claiming he was close to losing his house and that he had no one to turn to. According to her, he'd even hinted that he was in a crisis situation, which was far from the truth. I thanked her for reaching out, and it felt like a weight lifted knowing someone in the family saw through his act. Back at home, my girlfriend was my rock through all of this. She told me not to let them drag me down, reminding me that I had worked hard to get where I was. She even suggested setting up some sort of financial boundary or safety net, just in case my brother tried to come after me again. But the group chat wasn't slowing down. Every few hours, a new message would pop up, another family member voicing their concern or disappointment. I noticed a shift though. A few relatives had gone silent, maybe after hearing what my cousin had shared or realizing that things weren't as straightforward as my brother had made them seem. Eventually, I stopped responding in the chat. My brother continued to fire shots, saying that I was ignoring the family and cutting everyone off just because I had money now. Slowly, the messages trickled down, and I realized that the family was starting to ignore me too. It felt like they were following his lead, almost like he was trying to isolate me as some kind of punishment. I don't know what's coming next, but I have a feeling this isn't over. Reddit has been amazing with support, and my friends and girlfriend have been incredible, but I can't shake the feeling that my brother isn't done trying to push my buttons. I'm considering taking some of Reddit's advice to legally protect myself, especially if he keeps showing up unannounced. But for now, I'm standing firm. I won't let him or anyone else bully me into handing over what I've worked so hard for. Update 2. Not long after the group chat fiasco started to settle, I thought I might finally get some peace. But then, out of nowhere, I started getting notifications. Friends were messaging me, sending screenshots and links to a public post my brother had thrown up on Facebook. He had decided to take his issues with me to social media. The post was long and dramatic, filled with accusations and digs aimed right at me. He claimed that I had forgotten my roots, and that I thought I was too good for the family now that I had a stable career and money. He painted this picture of himself as a struggling, loyal brother who only ever needed a little help, while I was supposedly off living my luxurious life without a thought for anyone else. He even added in some wild exaggerations, saying he was on the brink of losing everything, and that I was his last hope, but I had turned my back on him in his time of need. It didn't take long for people to start commenting on his post. Friends of his, distant family members, even a few random people I didn't know, all chiming in to agree that I was selfish, heartless, and had forgotten where I came from. Some of my friends sent me screenshots of people from my own family, people I barely ever saw or spoke to, calling me out publicly for abandoning my brother. It was unreal. I had barely processed it all when things got even worse. Someone at my workplace saw the post and brought it up during a meeting. It was subtle at first, just a passing comment about family always being complicated, but it was clear they'd seen it. I had to brush it off, trying to keep things professional, but the whole situation had me seething. I wanted to confront my brother right then and there, to call him out for trying to ruin my reputation, especially among family and friends. But I stopped myself, realizing that reacting publicly would only add fuel to the fire. So, I held back, but it wasn't easy. The anger and betrayal sat heavy on my mind. Later that day, I checked my phone and saw a new message from my mom. She was guilt-tripping me again, saying that she didn't raise me to be so heartless and that my brother was suffering. She told me she was disappointed that I could stand by and watch family fall apart. She didn't mention the Facebook post directly, but it was obvious she'd seen it and probably thought it was justified. Her message was filled with this subtle manipulation, reminding me of family struggles and sacrifices, as if I was the one tearing everyone apart. I went back to Reddit, updating everyone on this latest twist, and the support was overwhelming. People encouraged me to protect my peace, to ignore the drama, and to focus on my own life. They reminded me that my brother's actions were manipulative and that I wasn't obligated to fix his mess just because we were related. But of course, my brother wasn't finished. Later that night, he sent me a direct message claiming he wanted to clear the air. He didn't apologize or acknowledge what he'd done. Instead, he doubled down, saying he'd give me one more chance to do the right thing and lend him some money. According to him, this was my chance to make things right, and if I didn't, he'd have no choice but to continue telling the truth about how I treated him. It was a thinly veiled threat, and I wasn't having it. I told him, once and for all, that I was done. No loans, no bailouts, nothing. He needed to sort out his own life, and I wasn't going to be his backup plan every time he screwed up. After that, I blocked him, determined not to let him keep dragging me down. But the whole ordeal got me thinking about protecting myself if he escalated further. I started looking into legal options, especially in case he decided to show up unannounced again or worse. I even considered setting up some financial safeguards, just in case he tried to go after my assets or start rumors that could hurt my reputation. To clear things up publicly, I shared another post on Reddit, clarifying that everything I had was earned through my hard work. I explained how I'd built my career from the ground up, without any support from family, and how I wasn't about to let anyone, even my own brother, undermine that. The Reddit community rallied around me, some sharing their own experiences, others just offering words of encouragement. It was honestly a relief to have people who understood the situation without judgment. Then, something unexpected happened. A distant relative reached out, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd seen the Facebook post, but after hearing about everything from me, she wanted to offer her support. She admitted that, growing up, she'd seen how my mom had always taken my brother's side, and she knew I was under constant pressure to help him. It was a small gesture, but it felt good to know that someone in the family saw through his act. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with calls from family members who hadn't reached out in ages. Each of them had their own version of advice, all hinting that I should just give in for the sake of peace. Some of them suggested that helping him just this once would keep the family together. I could tell they'd been influenced by his Facebook post, but I held firm, reminding myself of everything I'd gone through and all the support I'd found outside the family. The messages and calls eventually slowed down, but I could tell my brother was still pulling strings. The family had started ignoring me, some not even acknowledging me in the group chat anymore. The silence was intentional, like they were trying to punish me for standing my ground. At this point, I'm tired. I'm ready to move on with my life, focusing on my career and my relationship, even if that means cutting ties. I'm just done with being the one everyone relies on, especially when they turn on me the moment I say no. Reddit has been a lifeline, and for now, I'm keeping my distance from my family drama, determined to put my own life first. Update 3. A few days after my brother's social media spectacle, I got a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, my cousin. We'd never been close, mostly because she distanced herself from the family long ago. Growing up, I'd heard all sorts of stories about her, most of them hinting that she thought she was too good for the family. Now, though, I wondered if she'd seen something in the family dynamic that I was only just starting to understand. The message was simple. Saw what's been going on. Want to chat? Curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed. We met up for coffee that weekend, and I was surprised to find that she already knew a lot of what had been happening with my brother and the family drama. She told me she'd experienced similar issues years ago, being expected to give and sacrifice without receiving any support in return. In her case, it had reached a point where she had to cut contact entirely. Talking to her was eye-opening. She described the same cycle I'd been going through, her family expecting her to take care of everyone else, while any boundaries she set was met with guilt trips and manipulation. She hadn't wanted to abandon anyone, but eventually, for her own sanity, she'd walked away. Hearing her story was like looking into my own future, and for the first time in this whole mess, I felt truly understood. Meanwhile, my brother wasn't giving up. He sent a few more messages, all of them carefully worded, saying he just wanted one last chance to make things right. In the same breath, he'd remind me that he was really struggling and just needed a little help. It was clear he hadn't learned anything from all this. I left his messages unread, choosing to focus on the newfound connection I'd built with my cousin. We started talking regularly, and I found myself leaning on her as an ally in the middle of all the family chaos. A few days later, my mom switched up her tactics. Instead of her usual guilt tripping, she started sending softer messages, asking me to be the bigger person and let bygones be bygones. She didn't say it outright, but I could tell she wanted me to just give in, to put my brother's needs ahead of my own again. It was almost like she was testing a new approach, trying to appeal to my sense of family rather than pressuring me outright. I didn't respond to those messages either, realizing that this was just another attempt to get me back in line. Around this time, my partner's family caught wind of what was happening. They'd always been supportive, and when they found out about the stress my family was putting me through, they invited me over, saying I was welcome to stay there anytime if I needed a break. Their kindness hit hard. It was a reminder that not all families were like mine. While my own family was tearing itself apart over money and obligation, my partner's family just cared about my well-being, no strings attached. Rumors started circulating about my brother's financial situation. A distant relative told me that he'd taken out payday loans to cover his debts and that his finances were getting even worse. Part of me wondered if he'd dug himself so deep as a way to get me to feel sorry for him. I wouldn't put it past him. The way my family was behaving, you'd think I was the one causing all his problems, even though I hadn't had anything to do with his choices. Then, one evening, I got another message from my brother. This time, he tried a different approach, saying he was sorry for the way things had gone down. He admitted he'd been harsh, but he insisted he was really trying to get his life on track. He followed up the apology with, you guessed it, another request for help. Apparently, he'd looked into his finances and decided that with a little boost from me, he could make things right. It was frustratingly predictable, almost as if he thought saying sorry was enough to undo everything. I told him, as calmly as I could, that I wasn't going to help. This was his mess, not mine. I'd bailed him out before, and every time he'd only come back for more. He didn't respond after that, but I knew he wasn't done. A lot of people on Reddit had suggested therapy, saying it might help me build stronger boundaries and deal with the family guilt that kept surfacing. I'd brushed off the idea at first, thinking I could handle it on my own, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a good idea. It was becoming clear that my family would keep trying to pull me back in, and I needed to be prepared for that. I scheduled an appointment, hoping it might give me some clarity. Then, out of the blue, my mom had a full-blown meltdown. She called me in tears, going on about how she'd failed as a mother, how she'd lost her family. She said she'd never expected things to turn out this way, and blamed herself for all the conflict. I listened, but there was something about the way she phrased it, like she was subtly hinting that it was still within my power to fix things. It felt less like an apology and more like another manipulation, designed to get me to feel guilty for the situation. I walked away from that call with a new perspective. My family's behavior wasn't just a one-time issue, it was a pattern. They'd been using guilt and obligation as tools to keep me in line, and I was only now seeing it for what it was. Talking to my cousin and hearing her story had helped me see through the manipulation, and I knew I had to stay strong. For the first time in my life, I'm starting to put myself first. I love my family, but I'm done being their safety net, their problem solver. I've decided that, moving forward, I'm going to focus on my own happiness and well-being. If that means distancing myself from them, then so be it. I've spent enough time sacrificing my own peace for their comfort, and now, it's my turn to live my life. Update 4. After everything that had happened, the social media smear campaign, my mom's emotional pleas, and my brother's endless demands, I finally reached my breaking point. The constant messages, the family's attempts to guilt-trip me, and the random messages from strangers commenting on my heartlessness had become too much. I needed a way to protect myself from whatever might come next. So I did something I hadn't thought I'd need to do. I consulted a lawyer. At the lawyer's office, I explained everything that had been happening, from my brother's threats to my family's relentless pressure and the public drama on social media. The lawyer listened patiently, taking notes. When I finished, they suggested that a restraining order might be worth considering if the harassment from my brother escalated. They also mentioned other steps I could take to protect my finances, just in case things got even messier. I left the office feeling like I had options, a plan to hold firm against the chaos. Word got out pretty quickly that I'd met with a lawyer. I'm not sure who leaked it, but soon enough I was getting a barrage of messages from my mom and a few other family members. They were furious. My mom called me cruel and said I was going too far. According to her, this was a family issue, not something to be handled with outsiders. She seemed more upset about the idea of involving a lawyer than she ever had been with my brother's actual behavior. Other relatives joined in, calling my actions cold-hearted and accusing me of tearing the family apart. That was when my family insisted on a meeting to hash things out once and for all. I could tell it wasn't really going to be a conversation. They wanted me to fall back in line, to give in so things could return to normal. I wasn't eager to go, but I figured that showing up and stating my boundaries firmly might put an end to it. When I arrived, the tension was thick. My mom, brother, and a few aunts and uncles were already there, waiting for me like I was on trial. My brother went straight into his story, talking about how he was in a rough spot, how he needed family now more than ever. He glanced at me as he spoke, expecting me to break under the pressure like I usually did. When I didn't say anything, he doubled down, claiming that I was abandoning him and turning my back on the family. I waited until he finished, then calmly explained that my decision was final. I told everyone there that I wasn't going to keep funding my brother's lifestyle or enabling his bad decisions. I reminded them of how many times I'd already helped, only for him to end up in the same situation again. I made it clear that, moving forward, I would not be guilt-tripped or manipulated into sacrificing my own peace and stability for his mistakes. At that point, my brother tried a new tactic. He broke down in front of everyone, saying that he was truly desperate and that I was leaving him with nothing. He painted himself as the victim, hoping to sway the room to his side. A few relatives seemed moved, but before they could chime in, an aunt who had stayed neutral until now finally spoke up. She said she'd watched the family push me around for years, and she was tired of it. She told everyone that my brother had to take responsibility for his actions, and that it wasn't fair to expect me to keep picking up the pieces. Her words caught everyone off guard, and for a moment, the room fell silent. Then, my mom made one last attempt, tears in her eyes begging me to reconsider. She said family meant everything, and that by refusing to help my brother I was hurting all of them. She pleaded with me, as if I held the key to saving our family, but I held my ground. I told her that I'd spent my entire life being the responsible one, always stepping in to fix things, and that it was time for my brother to learn how to stand on his own. In a final burst of anger, my brother lost his composure. He accused me of flaunting my success, saying I'd always looked down on him. That was the last straw. I took a deep breath and listed every time I had helped him financially, the loans, the times I covered his bills, the support he never repaid or even acknowledged. I laid it all out, leaving no room for excuses. It was like a bucket of cold water over everyone. My brother, seeing that his story had unraveled, let slip something he'd never admitted before, that he just expected me to help him, because I had it to spare. His entitlement was on full display, and suddenly a few more family members seemed to get it. They started looking at him differently, as if finally seeing the truth behind his pleas. I left that meeting drained but resolute. I knew I'd done the right thing by setting boundaries, and while it was tough to face my family's disappointment, I could tell that some of them had begun to see the situation for what it was. My brother's mask had slipped, revealing the entitlement beneath all his struggles. Even if the family remained divided, I had finally spoken my truth, and that was enough for me. Afterward, I went home and shared the entire experience on Reddit. The response was overwhelming, with countless people encouraging me to stand my ground and assuring me I wasn't alone in dealing with family like this. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of relief. I'd taken the steps to protect myself, and I wasn't backing down. Update 5. After the family meeting and my brother's public meltdown, things didn't exactly calm down. My brother continued to message me, and I started hearing from family members yet again. I knew I needed to take stronger action to protect myself, so I decided to move forward with the restraining order, as my lawyer had suggested. It was a difficult step, but at this point I'd had enough. Filing the restraining order didn't go unnoticed. News of it spread through the family like wildfire. I started getting calls and texts immediately. My mother was especially outraged, calling it the final straw and accusing me of going too far. She seemed less concerned about my reasons and more focused on how the restraining order would look to other family members and even family friends. She called several times, demanding that I reconsider and cancel it, but I let her calls go to voicemail. Not backing down from the order only seemed to intensify her guilt tripping. Every day I'd get more missed calls and messages from her, all following the same pattern, accusing me of tearing the family apart and of being cold-hearted. She even dragged in memories from our childhood, trying to remind me of the sacrifices everyone made. When that didn't work, she went on social media, posting long-winded messages about how much pain the division in our family was causing her. She never mentioned the real reason, of course, just enough vague statements to stir up more family outrage. After one too many manipulative calls, I decided I needed to protect my peace and sanity. I blocked her number and went low contact with her. It wasn't an easy decision, but the constant pressure was becoming unbearable. I knew that keeping my boundaries meant cutting down on interactions, at least until she accepted that I was done enabling my brother. It wasn't long before my brother got even more desperate. He somehow got in touch with a few of my close friends, hoping to sway them to his side. He tried painting a sob story, claiming that I had abandoned him and left him with no options. He hinted that I'd changed since I got money and didn't care about the family anymore. My friends, knowing the full story, shut him down quickly. They sent me screenshots of his attempts and reassured me that they were on my side, not falling for his manipulation. I was relieved to see they weren't buying into his narrative. Around this time, I finally took Reddit's advice and started therapy. It was clear that my family's influence had shaped a lot of my past choices, and I wanted to understand how to build stronger, healthier boundaries. My partner and friends had been encouraging me to try therapy, and with everything I was going through, I knew it was time. The sessions helped me gain clarity on my family's manipulation and gave me tools to reinforce my decisions without getting pulled back into old patterns. With the family drama minimized, I was able to fully focus on my career again. Putting my energy into work was a breath of fresh air. Opportunities started opening up, and I was even considered for a big project that I'd wanted to be a part of for years. Without the constant weight of my family's demands, I felt like I was finally able to move forward. My performance at work improved, and my bosses took notice, which only fueled my motivation. Reddit continued to be a source of support through all of this. Every time I posted an update, people left encouraging messages, validating my decision to protect myself and reminding me that I wasn't alone in dealing with manipulative family dynamics. Their support felt like a virtual safety net, helping me stay strong and focused on my goals. Then, out of the blue, my mother sent a letter. In it, she claimed she missed me and wanted to put everything behind us. She wrote that the family wasn't the same without me and that she was willing to talk things through. She didn't say anything about respecting my boundaries, though. The whole letter read more like an attempt to reel me back in than an apology. I took some time to think about it, then wrote a brief, respectful reply. I told her that I was open to a relationship only if my boundaries were respected, and that included not being pressured to help my brother financially. After that, silence. My mother didn't respond, and I haven't heard from her since. It was like a final, unspoken acceptance that things would never be the same. But surprisingly, I felt okay with it. For the first time, I felt at peace with my decision to distance myself from the family's demands. I knew that I couldn't keep sacrificing my well-being for people who only wanted me around when I was giving. Throughout all of this, my cousin, who had gone through similar issues with her own family, became my closest confidant. She was someone who understood without needing an explanation, and we developed a bond over our shared experiences. We regularly checked in with each other, and her advice helped me see that I wasn't wrong for putting my own needs first. She reminded me that sometimes family can become a source of pain rather than support, and it was okay to choose myself. As I wrap up this chapter, I wanted to post one last update to thank everyone who followed my story and supported me along the way. Reddit has been a lifeline, a place where I could share my experiences without fear of judgment. Reading everyone's comments gave me the strength to hold my ground and make choices I didn't think I could make. Now, I'm moving on. I've set boundaries that I intend to keep, and I'm finally putting my needs first. My family may never accept my decisions, but that's okay. I've learned that I don't owe anything to people who don't respect my boundaries. This experience has shown me the importance of surrounding myself with people who support me for who I am, not for what I can give. Thank you, Reddit, for being there through all of this. Here's to closing this chapter and starting fresh.